Hi, my name is Grace Carlson. I am a part of Lauren Stobie's third block class. This is a book report for the book All Quiet on the Western Front. This book is written by Erich Remarque. He was a German, and in World War I, he is a World War I veteran. This book actually originated in German and is later translated into English. All Quiet on the Western Front is about a young man and his friends they were from the same school class. They went to school together. Him and his friends enlisting into the war and their years spent in the trenches. I believe it's 4 years that they spent in the trenches. So this is about their time together and, how they lived, the conditions there, and how they fought, the war that they fought. We start the story a little later into World War I. We start it near the end. And when the first pages of the book are about Erich dying, and then we go to the front lines where the bombardment happens and there's gas and there's this whole thing about Paul jumping into a casket, and it's this whole crazy thing, and we learn a lot from that moment. We learn that the author Erich, we learn that he loves detail, and the detail in some of those scenes it was cool. I mean, it was sad, but it was also very cool to see that detail. Then we learn of the harsh conditions of living in these trenches. There were lots of mice and rats, and we see them talk about how the rats and mice are eating their food. Then we see that Paul goes home after fighting. He gets to go home for a little while, but he unfortunately comes home to his sick mother, which is devastating, and so he's very frustrated. He's frustrated that he wish he would have just stayed in the trenches and never have come home, because he hated the news that his mother was sick. And then he gets stationed away from his friends somewhere else for some more additional training, which I believe this is the camp, the camp where there was additional training. I believe this is the camp that was right next to a prison, a German prison, I believe, and which these conditions weren't much better than the trenches. Living next to this prison were not much better than the trenches. It was obviously probably a little cleaner, but again, it was still shortage of food. There were probably still rats and mice. Then he later regroups with his friends, and he has trouble fitting back in with the friend group again. He's making mistakes, slipping up, little things like that. He can't seem to fit anymore. And then when he goes back to the trenches, like after meeting up with his friends and going back to the trenches, he heads into no man's land. And when he's heading into no man's land, we really see that moment where he's so conflicted on what he should do, if he should just stay put. And honestly, it was really, really a moment where he was like, but my friends need me. And so he went out into no man's land anyway, and knowing that he probably wouldn't make it out alive, but he did. He went in there anyways and fought, because he knew that his friends were out there with him and he didn't want them to be alone. In no man's land, he kills a French soldier, and it was honestly, I felt a beautiful moment. Even though the French man did die, it was honestly a really beautiful moment in my opinion. After killing the French man and some other filler stuff, he gets injured under fire and is later, taken to the hospital, and I believe with Albert, and then discharged. And then there's again some more filler stuff in between that and the end of the book. But at the end of the book, he dies, Paul dies. And also at the end of the book, there is there's little pages or little scenes for each character and how they died, which I also thought was really cool. And I thought that, even though it was a sad ending, that was a really cool notion to have. Like, that was a really cool thing. It was a moment where it was like, even though that's really sad, that's really cool. And honestly, I would read the book again just because of the ending. The inciting incident would be the inciting incident, and the climax would be when Paul killed the French soldier. And then the resolution would obviously be when Paul died at the end, and it was all quiet on the Western Front. My favorite character is also the main protagonist, Paul. He's social, and honestly, I was not expecting him to be so social, and he really was. And he's also sensitive. He is still a young man, and, you know, pulls at your heartstrings when sad stuff happens. He's also very kind. I was not expecting him to be so kind and loving towards his friends. It was not something I expected. I believe that he wanted to share the knowledge that this war wasn't everything as it was made out to be. It wasn't this, I mean, it was an honor to be in the war, but it wasn't all, you know, rainbows and cupcakes. It was, the war was destroying people before they had time to get killed. And it was brought up so very often that it was killing people, and it was hurting him. You could see the mental conflicts are happening throughout the book with Paul and with others. This story takes place during World War I, behind the front lines. We see the trenches, which are dirty and gross and honestly should not have been inhabited by people. And I believe we see two different camps. I believe we see the camp that him and his friends stayed at. I believe they stayed in a camp where they trained. It was like where they trained. It was less of a camp and more where they trained. And then there was the place where Paul got his additional training, which was away from his friends. But the additional training camp that Paul had gone to, I believe there is a prison right next to, which we also hear a little bit about. So I thought I would mention it because it was right next to it. Thought I should mention it. But the camps were obviously a little better than the trenches, a little cleaner, but they were also not very, you know, like they were not pristine living places or conditions. And then we also see a little bit of the hospital in the beginning and later, I believe, in the book. And constantly you hear about the hospital, or wherever you're in the hospital, you hear about how clean it smells, maybe not how clean it looks, but how clean it smells, and the white, and how clean it is compared to everywhere else. And the disinfectant smell is brought up very often. The theme. I believe the main theme of All Quiet on the Western Front is brutality of war. And it's brought up on almost every page that you read. If not every page, every other page. You know, every page or every line you read is trying to convey to you that war is not always that it seems. And it's this theme is really shown at the end of the book when most of the main characters die. I can't say all, most of them die. And I pulled some quotes that I felt really, really showed this. I'm gonna say them because I thought these quotes they're both said by Paul. Both of these are said by Paul, and I felt that they were really, really like heartfelt. I believe this is Paul early on the book. We are not youth any longer. We do not want to take the world by storm. We are fleeing. We fly from ourselves, from our life. We are 18 and had begun to love life in the world, and we had to shoot it to pieces. And then my other one was earlier in the book when he's talking about himself, and I believe it's when he's in the trenches with the boy who leans on him, and he's talking about how young they are and they shouldn't have to be there. I am young. I am 20 years old, yet I know nothing of life but despair, death, and fictitious superficiality. Cast over an abyss of sorrow, I see how peoples are set against one another, and in silence, unknowingly, foolishly, obediently, innocently slay one another. Which, that last quote it was really deep, and it really was like, these are basically children fighting. Personal reactions, my favorite moment, unfortunately, would have had to have been when Paul died. and it was All Quiet on the Western Front. It really tied the whole book together and brought the whole book back around again, and it made it like that moment would make me want to read the whole book over again. And I found my favorite character was Paul, and not just because he was the main protagonist, but the qualities that he had that made him likable and that made you want to like him. My favorite, unfortunately he is my favorite character because of that moment with the French soldier. It was a really deep moment, and Paul talked about how he was going to help this man's family after he had killed him. He was going to set them up for life, make sure they were taken care of, and that really spoke to his character as well. Like, it showed how kind he was in that moment. I didn't really dislike any part of the book. It was honestly really good, and the insight in war was also very good. I would definitely read this book again. I loved it. Loved the book 100%. I thought it gave real insight into what war looked like. Would definitely read again. I would give it an 8 out of 10, only because in some places it was hard to understand what I was reading, but it wasn't so bad that I couldn't understand. It was hard to read, but not hard enough I didn't understand what the lines were trying to convey.